and I think the basic tenet of that is you cannot start early enough to start organizing and recruiting. So the I'm In campaign, we all thought, wait a minute, this is only like, I don't know, April of whatever it was.
April of, I think it was 2011.
Right.
Yeah.
And we were all kind of washing around being happy with ourselves for passing the ACA and, you know, not quite sure what the next step was. And pretty soon, we got this directive from headquarters about the I'm In campaign, which, you know, none of us really thought was a great, like a lot of new stuff, people are not very excited about it at the beginning and they don't really get the concept. And I don't know if you were there, Kyoka, but I remember this meeting that we had. We used to have these regional meetings where we'd go around Northern California, and it was the very beginning of the I'm In campaign, and I tried to explain it with a lot of enthusiasm, even though I didn't really know what I was talking about. And we all kind of thought, okay, well, we sort of get this, and we sort of, you know, it had a very much a relationship component, which is huge, was huge, and to me still is a huge element in any successful campaign, of building personal relationships based on common values with the people you're working with. And the other component was a big data component. And this is what I have found really difficult out in the rest of the world, the big world. People don't take data as seriously as the Obama campaign did. And so we were just talking about this earlier, that when you go out into some organizations that think they want to adopt the Obama model, it's very hard for them to realize that when you get an I'm In card, which happened, you know, early on, and you ask people, not only are you in, but what, you know, some various pieces of information about what skills they have and what they'd like to do in the campaign, that all of this has to be entered as data, and it has to be entered immediately. And so there's this sense, the other thing I was talking to Sarah about was the Obama campaign was very much guided by the idea of not just doing the best you can, but of excellence and doing even better than you think you can. And that involves a lot of commitment, and it involves being part of a large group who share that as a value, even though you may not always get there. The idea that you all agree that this is a value makes a big difference in a campaign and in the way that people, the level of commitment that people have toward their work. And then the training element is huge. If you want your volunteers to be effective, and you want to be effective, you really need to understand your goals, and you need to be able to think about what the strategy is, and that, I think, is really important in California. And I have some different ideas about strategies I'd like to see in California, but, and then you have to figure out what tactics are going to be most effective. So understanding that training component and having that be an integral part of everything you do has been, to me, one of the key elements of successfully mobilizing a state to do its work, whether it's export work or work within the state.
I want to do a quick audience poll and then kick a quick follow-up question back to you,
Okay.
Willa. From the audience, will you raise your hand if you're here because you lead a local group? It's okay if we don't have anyone that's leading. Okay, a lot of people who lead local groups, great. Will you raise your hand if you're here because you're a member of a local group? Okay, raise your hand if you're here because you're thinking about maybe running for office. Nice. Raise your hand if you're here because...
That's hard.
I know, right? We got
you.
your back. Wish a couple more ladies raise your hand for that one. Raise your hand if you're here because you're not involved yet, but you want to figure out how to get involved. Okay, excellent, perfect. That's hopefully a good perspective for those of us up here. Lila, I'm wondering, as you think about, I wrote 4 things down: relationship-oriented, data-oriented, commitment-oriented, and then really invested in training and willing to set aside time, even at a fast pace, to cross-train or to take a moment and do skills deep dives. When you think about how that might translate for folks in this room, the majority of whom, based on that quick poll, are leading groups, what are a couple sort of weekly practices or monthly practices you would hope people are already sort of embodying in the way they're leading their groups?
The recruitment aspect, I think, is really critical because, as leaders, you need to bring in as many people as possible. So I would say setting goals, recruitment goals for yourself and the people in your group. Setting goals is huge, and they might seem unattainable. They usually do seem, you don't want them to be so high that they really are truly unattainable, but they definitely need to be higher than you think you can comfortably accomplish, because you can actually set the goal, especially if, one of the things I learned, and I come from a heavy background in the women's movement where competition was kind of a bad word, and everything was supposed to be done by consensus. But one of the things I really learned to enjoy in the Obama campaign was competition. It was really fun because we did have this basis of shared values, and it was friendly, sort of. I still see people that our relationship, we still talk about who got more recruits in some area than the other person in, another area of the state. And so I learned a lot that, about setting the bar high, and then what it takes to hit that bar. And it takes a lot of hard work. That's one of the things I really want to emphasize that Sarah alluded to, and that is that organizing is not easy and it's not glamorous. But if you've got each other, it can be really fun and very enlivening. You feel like you're doing something that matters, and there's nothing better, really, than feeling like your life is devoted to making a difference for your community, for your state, for your country, for your kids, or whatever. It's so
gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. So we're going to go to Brad, who is a digital guru to the extent that he's actually written a book. It's one of the few books. I know. Do you have a copy of it here?
I actually have a few copies, yeah.
Perfect. So,
and my office is nearby. I could actually go get more.
He's written a book called The Digital Plan. One of the things that I found when I was starting to train organizers at scale is that there's actually very few resources in the academic world or the literary world for people that want to do this type of work, because those of us who are community organizers rarely stop and take the time to write about it, unfortunately. So Brad has written one of the few books that I really recommend to basically everyone. This and a book called Managing to Change the World, which is by the Management Center, one of the only management training entities in the progressive world. So he did so much and learned so much in all the different Obama contexts that he really codified it. What were some of your tenets when you think back at 2012 and what made it successful? Some of the tenets that might, we'll talk in a bit about translating to the local context here in California. Mm-hmm. What are your basic rules of the road?
That there are none. I actually think that may be a big part of it. I was thinking about some things specifically while you were talking, how I would kind of share some of that. I think a lot of what we were thinking about in 2012, and the interesting thing is like the digital tech social media landscape has actually changed significantly. Like we're like in a fundamentally different paradigm, and so sometimes folks kind of forget that when they're talking about best practices and stuff. And so I think that's really real. But the things that are kind of timeless is like the tools need to make sense. And so the unique space that I sat on is that I was working to help actually figure out, well, I started as a regional digital desk thinking about strategy across battleground and export states. Sometimes working with California, sometimes not. It's interesting how the regions shift a lot in a quickly moving campaign. And a big part of the focus, though, was digital training, which then became my title and kind of sole project, which was awesome. I worked a lot with Sarah thinking about that. But a lot of it was actually thinking about how did we like train and deploy the tools that we were building as a campaign, and like were they actually solving a problem for organizers? And a piece of that is like developing systems that make sense for real people. And it's interesting how the trainings on the tools didn't just help people use the tool. At times they actually helped overall buy-in with the campaign, because they especially on the volunteer side, there was a huge value in it. good tools that like shift a thing actually help you think about application to other tools, right? Actually help people shift how they were thinking a little bit. And I think a really interesting thing that's kind of at the core of it, I'm on the campaign, and a lot of our strategy was very content based. How do you develop engaging content that tells the story of organizing, that tells the story of issues? And there's actually a huge training component of story as well. And some of our big failures when we tried to roll out some of our tools, and these can be real applicable to other things as well, is some of the trainings were pretty technocratic. It was like, here is how you do a function, and the function does another function to a layer of functions. And it turns out like humans aren't robots, and literally just starting with a story of how this makes your life better or how this makes the campaign better. Because to be honest, some of the tools we deployed did not make the organizer's life better, but made the planning of the campaign better. And actually being real about that sometimes. So we had folks who may remember there was a thing called MyBo back in the day where you did your events in community. But then we built a total internal system called Dashboard, which went through like 3 or 4 rollouts, some of them a disaster. People got really different trainings, and some of them were very technocratic. And then some trainings were like real upfront, like, hey, this will be broken, but here's why it's gonna be better, and here's like why you have to kind of lead this space and be willing to ride through this, because it actually helps the campaign make decisions on resources and understand what's happening if you use this, and we keep making it better together. And painting a story of how it could be better is a really big part of it. There's and it's interesting, it's a thing I was learning in there, but there's actually a whole school of thought by this group called Common Craft that and they have an amazing book called The Art of Explanation, where they were actually the folks who did the trainings for Dropbox and Google Drive and all of that. And literally they're like, get commonality, explain a problem, and then tell a story of how the problem gets better. And that's how you start the training, right? And it's like, oh yeah, of course that makes sense, right? And so there's that piece, but I actually 100% believe everywhere is not the same. And that actually even applies to like online and digital tools. Like that's a real thing. And so this idea that all things fit all organizations and all regions, I actually don't think is...
I'm going to take you back 2 steps, because I'm curious if we think about this group in the context of a lot of local group leaders and some local group members, the biggest difference between them and what we faced in the super well-resourced Obama 2012 world was we could build tools in-house to achieve some of these ends, but these guys really are faced, for the most part, with using existing tools that are in the world. What are your top maybe 3 or 4 tools that you've seen organizers at the hyper-local level with not a lot of resources use that in a way that vivifies some of these tenets that you've laid out?
Yeah, I mean, think Action Network, huge proponent of it. They do a lot of actually pretty sophisticated stuff around email, even though they're doing a little bit of supporter management, petition sort of stuff called Action Elements, and it is, well, the core functions are very scalable, and you can kind of add on some stuff, and it starts at free, and then like the next tier is $10, which is amazing and rare. Yeah, huge fan of Action Network.
And we are using lots of Slack.
Slack, yeah, that's actually.
Some people hate it. Others love it.
Yeah, so I think that's fair. I think that's a place where community norms are really important. Slack can be those. If you aren't familiar with Slack is a hybrid messenger. It's like part messenger, part organizational document structure. You can do a lot of. It's a very powerful tool. It starts with message as its core function in a way that can be really great and can also be super overwhelming and like actually like frazzle people very quickly. And it crosses a spectrum, right? Like in the middle, it's used amazing and people love it, and on the far end, it's a ghost town, and the other side, it's so heavily used that people actually stop volunteering because they can't figure out what's going on. And I've actually experienced that full range. One of the projects I work on is Unite Blue, if you've ever seen that on Twitter. and we had some aggressive Slack users that like actually other people like just quit volunteering because they were like, I can't figure out what's going on here. So
Facebook, Twitter, and Google Docs,
Yeah.
Google Sheets are 3 of the ones that I use the most as an organizer.
Yeah.
What do you see newer activists, because some of these guys are new activists, others of them are welcoming new activists in view of their recruitment efforts, doing wrong on those super used platforms when they think about it in an organizing context?
Yeah. Organizing and not organization.
Okay.
Right? Is that the question?
Can we actually ask who's using Facebook, Twitter, and
Do folks here use Facebook and Twitter as organizing tools, or not really? Yes. Facebook, not Twitter. And people really don't use Twitter anymore. It's really,
It's really hard to
It's just-
get people to use Twitter for some
Yeah,
reason,
yeah.
especially like they just don't. I don't know. I think it's because when people first created their Twitter accounts, they followed all these people, and then they haven't really gone back to like tweak it, and then they get overwhelmed into like this hole of like Entertainment Tonight and like some congressional stuff and and so I feel like even with Facebook feed, you have to go back and like tune it, and I feel like people are like, oh, you can do that.
Yeah, Twitter's like a place to view other people's updates. Facebook is a place to share things more so. But any other observations about other tools to check out or not to check out?
Yeah, I would say like a key piece is Facebook groups.
Okay.
And like having that as a nuanced thing separate from a Facebook page. I think Facebook groups are real powerful for local organizing. Like the thing I would love to say is like peer-to-peer text messaging, but it's the current cost to that is fairly out of reach. And I think like general SMS is also pretty out of reach. We have a side project I'm working on is actually like figuring out how to actually build a low cost entry level thing that uses Action Network and SMS because and folks are probably hearing this a lot, right? Like, well, I don't know if you're hearing this a lot. There's a lot of conversation in the progressive space about peer-to-peer text messaging and how awesome that is. The cost to use it is super high, so the barrier to entry is beyond most local organizing groups. And broadcast SMS, where people opt into your list and you shoot them a message, is also either it's kind of expensive and the tools are really clunky, or it's like $2,000 to opt in, and it's just like not within reach. And there are some outliers, but it's like you really have to hunt and find those outliers. And so I think SMS can be really powerful if you can find the right solution.
Brad, for the non-tech savvy, can you explain? I think I know what SMS is. I think I know what peer-to-peer text messaging, but what's the difference between, say, peer-to-peer text messaging and just texting people? Is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So SMS is just the shorthand for text messaging, so any text message that goes out. There's one category that's broadcast text message. So like when you join a list, whether you join it on a web form or it's like text this keyword to whatever, and you get updates. I think the reality is like very few people get them from organizations. Most of us get them from like rewards apps. It's like you're on your way to getting your free coffee. And so that there's this broadcast SMS that is that normally works in one of two ways. You sign up to a list, every once in a while you get a random text message that's like, do this thing, whether that's sign a petition or like, come get your discount on a Frappuccino. And then the term peer-to-peer text messaging is a interesting gray space. There are a few tools. Hustle and Relay are the two kind of main tools. Then there's some others that are starting to pop up. There's Hustle, there's Relay, and what they allow you to do is text people who have not truly opted into your list, because it functions. I as an individual, if I had like a spreadsheet, I could text everyone on that spreadsheet if I wanted to under FAA rules. There's nothing that stops me from texting whoever I want. FCC, yeah. Yeah.
FAA would be fun.
Yeah. Yeah. You can text while you're up there, but you can't call. So I guess they're involved somehow. These tools allow you to get around that, where like you can actually bulk load list and like do it in an interesting way and maintain a relationship in this what they call peer-to-peer text messaging. And a lot of folks have leveraged that in great ways for like event turnout, right? So it's like you have, and just to kind of maybe go in the wonky weeds just a little bit for folks.
Going wonky weed for one tangent, then I'm going to kick it back to the
One
camera.
tangent, okay. The broadcast stuff, there's real, because of the F that you mentioned, CC, opting into an SMS list is a very specific thing that needs to have very clear opt-in, opt-out, stop messaging stuff, and if not, you can get all of your service shut down. The peer-to-peer stuff is not regulated by that, and so if I have a list of folks and I just want to invite them to an event or to come volunteer, I can do that. And so it's been highly effective because people's open rate on text messaging is like 90-some% all the time, and so the conversions, people showing up, is amazing.
And emails like 3%.
Yeah. So.
Yep, amazing. So on that note, I actually wanted to get you guys in a popcorn style again, to just popcorn a few of the things that were a la mode or effective in 2012 that are no longer effective. So I'm going to do a couple examples of it. I'm going to put them here. I have one more follow-up question, and then we're actually going to kick it to the audience to ask other questions yourselves now that you have a bit more understanding of these guys' unique areas of expertise. Phone calls. Really different use nowadays than they were in 2012. In 2012, we used phone calls, and we had about it was usually like a 15 to 20% contact rate, where 15 to 20% of random people that you would call would answer their phone. Random voters. Now the answer rate is in some cases 5 to 8%, really low for random phone calls. This won't be surprising to all of you. Still effective as a volunteer engagement, and like once people have already signed up to be a part of your crew, it's still effective. But I think what we keep seeing is text messages are, particularly with younger folks, an easier way to stay in touch. So I'm going to put that one thing different in 2012 than it is today, phone calls. What do you got, Lola?
I'm just thinking about the differences in different regions and different levels of sophistication in terms of using phones and emails and texts, that we need to be, we could make some generalizations in 2012 about people, but now we need to be much more specific about who we're trying to reach and what's the best way to reach those people. Because there are people that still answer their phones, but they just don't live they certainly don't live in states where they are swing states.
And actually that gets beautifully to Samir's point earlier.
Because they have gotten so overwhelmed with phone calls. So, rural areas, people still answer their phones. Certain areas that never get called because they're so blue or so red or whatever.
It's a really good point.
So just, I think we need to learn to target much more carefully.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because we have been doing the ACA calls, and see certain districts, they are getting lots of calls, but people are still actually picking up the phone, talking to us, and thanking us.
Yeah.
So it's just like different regions, activism is different, and even like texting, there is a hustle group in here, and I talked about the data part, and there probably the ratio is 5 to 10% because they are just a totally cold texting. Versus I have been working with Bunny Campaign, Our Revolution, it's almost like 10 to 20% yes, doing something big. So targeting really matters. So the data analysis and strategy do matter a lot.
Yep, gorgeous. Brad, a couple things from you, popcorn style?
That worked and don't work now?
Yeah, stuff that's different today from how we ran things in 2012.
Yeah, there was a really cool thing we could do in 2012 that was like peer-to-peer Facebook messaging. They killed that in 2013 because they realized that data was better sold as ads. And so every once in a while people are like, oh, that thing, how can we build that? And it's like, you can't. There's no fundamental way to build that anymore. So that doesn't exist.
I think not having President Obama is huge. I don't want to state the obvious, but now that you are all in these multiple groups of resistance groups, there's no central organizing person. And in a way, there are some advantages to that, because when you had President Obama, everyone could make certain assumptions about how people wanted to be engaged and why they wanted to be engaged. And now,
and whether we're gonna have a nuclear war tomorrow, things like that.
right, just a few minor details. There is the opportunity to engage a lot of people that didn't, and this is true especially in Northern California, that didn't want to be so involved with President Obama, much as I personally love him. I spent most of my time as an organizer here fighting with other lefties about why he wasn't progressive enough. And so, I loved what you said, Samir, about learning to talk to each other better and more openly. I think that's a big the fact that there are lots of smaller groups gives us an opportunity that maybe wasn't there when everyone was looking toward a central figure. We're now looking more toward one another. And if that's gonna work, then we have to be able to talk to each other. And I think this is a problem that's it's hard for Northern California, because there's kind of an overlayer, assuming that we all believe the same thing, but we don't. And we kind of have to be willing to look at that. So that's a thought I had as we were talking.
What do you think, Brad, when you think about what it means to not have a center of gravity anymore, and what your advice to this crew would be in light of that? Everyone's leading lots of different disparate groups. It was the first point that someone made about rebuilding progressive infrastructure with lots of disparate groups and decentralized leadership. What's your advice?
30 seconds.
Yeah. I actually think it's good for democracy. I actually think like one of my big takeaways, and there's a whole bunch of things that spin out of that, is by the time we were moving through 2011 and 2012, we were doing a kind of community organizing and a kind of organizing. I don't know it, most of the time I wouldn't even lump it as community organizing. It was very tactical, strategic organizing, and it was a very top-down command model. And I think one of our big problems in the progressive space is a lot of folks' first introduction to organizing was the Obama campaign. And I think if you came in end of 2008 or especially 11, 12, we were calling a thing community organizing, I think, which doesn't mean a lot of actual definitions of community organizing. It was much more tactical organizing, where there were clear specific goals, clear specific targets. And not that community organizing shouldn't have that, but it's actually different than like truly building local power and getting people to engage in specific ways. And I actually think and so one, it's like, I think it's really actually helpful for the progressive left to actually be engaging in more of these groups and actually building more decentralized power, because we also had a vacuum of power. Mm-hmm. And there was even, there was an attempt post-election called Rebuild the Dream in 2013 to kind of build this other kind of structure, and it didn't work for a lot of reasons. And there's a reason why national campaigns are a coalition of a lot of different interests pushing in one way. And I think investing too much in one star is actually really unhelpful to us as a people invested in democracy. And so building power with your local group is actually more sustainable over time, mm-hmm. and super important, and harder, which is why I think people in some degrees stopped doing it for a while, right? Mm-hmm. There were stronger movements that kind of, the 80s, they started to crack apart, and we're kind of living in this resurgence of it, and it's hard and messy, and that's kind of reality.
Well, there was also a real split between the established Democratic Party and the Obama campaign. And that did a lot of damage, because the Democrats were used to relying on the presidential candidate to help them build their organization. And because the Obama campaign came in as a different organization, didn't rely on the Democratic Party usually until the very end, where we sort of coordinated. There was a lot of bad feeling among people who had devoted their lives to building the Democratic Party, and maybe they didn't do it in the way that, you know, you might wish they had, but they felt very disrespected. And I think we have an opportunity to actually bring all of these different kinds of Democrats and progressives, because they are progressive, even though they may not be as action-oriented as I would like, to bring them together again. So I think there's that opportunity now that there isn't the central figure.
I drew a really inelegant little chart here of the different cadres, and now we're all wiggly lined into the, like, covering our heads, trying to figure out what to do next, because there's no mom and dad, there's no elder states person. We're all just like, we are the elder states people. So I'm gonna open it up to questions now, and would love to hear from some folks we haven't heard from yet. So we're gonna do the step up, step back for a second, and then we'll go to folks we have heard from. Yep.
One quick technology you didn't mention is push notification, which works the same way as text but doesn't cost any money. And if you need a tool, like there's the Amplify app, for example, where you can push, like your basically has like scripts and actions for your group, and then you can do push notification and indivisible SF. It's worked really, really well for us. So just one quick thing there. But I worked on 08 and 12 with Obama, and with the exception of a couple bad apples I ran into, it was sort of the culture that I think made it effective. And frankly, like the reason I'm here in this room is to kind of hear more about how I know the culture sort of came from the top, but how that filtered down to people like yourselves to maintain it and make it work, because I think that's kind of, like as someone who's trying to build up some of the structures we're talking about right now, building that culture is something which I both aim for and struggle with all the time.
So in my view, there really wasn't a top. There was a top, but sometimes I would forget that President Obama was the President of the United States, because it felt like he was my buddy, that, you know, he became like a friend. And Sarah, for instance, has, you know, been my boss in various capacities. And there was never a sense, the hierarchy was very flat. So, like, we all kind of knew each other. And part of that was because there were a lot of trainings, there were a lot of meetings where we would be together in a variety of capacities, so that even if somebody was your boss, you still knew a lot about them personally. And we used the value of telling stories, even, you know, whether they were action-oriented or not. There wasn't a distinction really between people who were at headquarters and people who were out in the States, or people who were, you know, there was some, but not like in big corporations, I would say. I think it was a very flat hierarchy, which made a big difference in terms of the culture permeating, because, you know, I used to tell people a story about, I don't think this is totally true, but now, but I think there was a point at which Jim Messina, who was the campaign, you know, overall campaign head, stayed in people's homes. There's, you know, when you go out, you stay in the homes of people who are campaign supporters. And we used to talk about how much money Romney spent on hotels and paying his senior staff, and that simply was not the case in the Obama campaign. Whatever your level, you did everything you could to save money for the campaign, to do what was important, which was not staying in fancy hotels and having a big expense account, or even a big salary. So I think that made a difference, that everybody was more or less on the same level, and then the frequency of contact made a huge difference as well. And we were all together for various kinds of trainings, and there was a longevity aspect. We'd all been doing it for a very long, there was two things. There was this longevity aspect where you learned a lot from people who'd been in the campaign from the very beginning, like Sarah, and lots of people that were in the campaign. But there was also an openness and welcomingness to somebody who was new and had never been involved in a campaign before. And there was an effort to include everybody. Huge effort of inclusion. I mean, we had, when I was in Nevada, we had a woman who would come in who was in her 80s, late 80s, and before she came in, we would prepare signs that needed to have, like, solid colored, they need to have the print solidly colored.
Filled in.
And we would set up a workstation for her so that she could do this work, which needed to be done. And she was very much a part of the team, and we, made this huge effort to find the right role for everyone, so that everyone felt included. So.
Brad, anything to add on culture?
Yeah, lots of thoughts on that. I do think, and it sounds like you had the healthy balance of tactical versus actual community
I might
organizing.
be romanticizing a little bit.
Well, no, I think what you just described there at the end was actual community organizing, of like finding a way for someone who wants to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that actually existed in every office, because a lot of like young organizers just got this very tactical thing, and if someone couldn't do data, knock doors, make phone calls, they're like, well, I don't really have a role for you here, because there are no envelopes to stuff.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that happened in a number of places. And I think that speaks to, though, like, you came more from the community organizing background, right?
Mm-hmm.
And learned that. And I think I'll share, I have lots of thoughts on some of the structural stuff of the campaign. I actually think some of the flatness and expense stuff was inequitable. I think there were a lot of staff who came from upper middle class backgrounds, and for them,
Yes, I agree with that. So.
for them taking those pay cuts and stuff worked, because they weren't saddled with student loans and a number of other things. I think there were fewer of us, especially in HQ, a very small minority of folks who didn't come from financially privileged backgrounds, and the campaign was like a much different struggle. And I think it had some real bad ripples, and also people who left there making decisions in other places, how they paid people and expected them to work and behave. And I actually think there's some like real structural problems. And I actually hear, interestingly, like the Hillary's campaign was actually much better on that, and so big applause to them. And Bernie paid their interns, and I think there are a lot of beautiful things that have happened since then. And so I think those pieces are real. And though I do think, though, there was an intention to be more flat and human. And I think those things are really valuable in like appreciating humans as humans, and that like we are organizing together for a common goal because we care about these things. And I think one specific thing I think that was very helpful, and I don't actually know if this existed everywhere, so I can't truly speak to that, but on the specific team I worked in HQ, we had come to a common agreement where we could go into a meeting, we would fight like hell to make the best decision and what we thought was the best decision, but we would agree, even if we lost on the decision, when we walked out of the room, we were living with whatever decision was made in the room, and we would be supportive, and it would end there. And I think that was one of the most healthy cultural things I've ever seen. After OFA space, I worked in a much more radical organization, and I tried to introduce that concept, and folks didn't like it. And then a lot of burnout. It just leads to bad things. If you can't agree on commonality and making decisions together, I think those things are really important. And I think it's interesting, my feelings on the like consensus models also.
Decision making is so key.
So key. I think you can have a system by which consensus input happens, and then clear mechanisms by which a decision is made and lived by. And I think that is incredibly helpful, because as someone what we had in those meetings was like, what you're looking for is some sort of group consensus on what is the best way forward, in an agreement that the decision maker will make a decision, and then you will be party to that, and put on your big kid pants and keep doing the work.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Do you want to add something before we go to another question?
Yeah, just a small thing. So I was a regional field organizer. That was a volunteer position, and we were shared a huge amount of the staff level stuff. So California, there were like 50 of us, and we actually spent pretty much whole our life for over a year to develop the community neighborhood teams, and that really worked well. And we were shared lots of stuff. However, the war between the staff and those volunteer leaders were very strong and divisive. So when I became actually the staffer, I actually realized that more. So there are always kind of something we can just talk about. But what incredible was those leadership and also the data people we actually had in California were all volunteers. And we had very high access to the data system, and we developed a lot of stuff on the ground. And that was just the amazing part. And that is something I didn't see neither Bernie campaign or Hillary campaign. I worked as volunteer in the leadership level, but that's not something happened. So that was unique for the Obama campaign. And I hope we're going to have more of those empowered volunteers who actually can do things, just to give those people the real job and the real tool. That would be great.
Yeah. All right, we're going to go to a question. We got 10 minutes remaining, so I'm going to ask you two, if you want to direct the question to a specific person, go for it. Otherwise, I'm going to cut you guys short in your answers so we can get to more folks.
Maybe this is more of a Lila question, but yeah, I'm Larry. I live in Berkeley. To give rank and file volunteers more of a buy-in to the campaign, if there's a way to democratize the campaign itself a little more, not that you want to fall into the pitfall of people who tell you what you do but don't do anything, but in terms of even if they can have input on messaging or strategy or things like that to feel like they're part of the
Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with what Kyoko was talking about, and that's access to information. If you give people a lot of information and trust them with it, it's a big issue of trust too. I mean, the more people feel trusted, I thought Obama trusted people with amazing, like especially in 08, people were doing stuff that was, nobody knew about. There was all this creative stuff going on, and I think the sort of rationale behind it was that the people who are going to really have a negative impact as a result of their way they're working is going to be so minute compared to the overall positive impact of trusting people to do good work, that it's minimal and it's worth taking that risk. So, I think trust is a big factor, and giving people figuring out what people are good at and then letting them do it, and making sure they know that they're doing a good job. I mean, it's, I think acknowledgement, and also I think there's another factor that I learned a lot about, and that's supporting leadership, and the leadership also has to support the volunteers, and it has to be a very two-way relationship.
Maybe I could just suggest like polling volunteer base or something like that.
Anything you can do to get input, and but very much what Brad was saying, there also has to be, like, there's this fine balance between when neighborhood team that I know Sarah remembers vividly went off on its own and was going to do whatever it wanted and wanted absolutely no input from some of the area leaders, and that doesn't work. Nor does it work to have things being so tight that people can't feel like their opinion isn't valued and their input is not respected.
I just drew something on the board. Marshall Gans is another famous community organizer I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. But when he talks about different models of leadership, he draws these three charts, and he talks about centralized leadership, when there's one person in charge making all the tactical decisions and all the strategic decisions. What ends up happening is that person gets overwhelmed because all the little dots of all those group members are always coming to them for any type of big decision. Leadership that is like disparate is there might be one person in the middle, but they haven't aligned on strategy, and so all the different group members go in a different direction because they answered the poll and they feel like, oh, I have the answer and now we're good to go, right? And then we talked about sort of the snowflake model, which is a little unfortunate given the way everyone's using snowflakes nowadays. Right, exactly. But like basically the team model, which we like really in a militaristic way employed at OFA in all the different iterations, was about really clearly saying, like, I'm Sarah, I'm the leader. I am the leader because I did all this stuff and I had better numbers than all of you and I did it in a respectful way. And you guys are going to be my team members. I don't know yet that Brad is epic and amazing at digital and Lila is the best community organizer I've met. But we're gonna have a strategy brainstorm together and think about what the needs are in our community. I'm gonna ask people in the group to offer up different things they might be excited to take on. Ask them to commit to a really specific time they're going to deliver a specific thing. I send a couple emails reporting out to the group so everybody has visibility into what the different people are doing, and then the report backs and a lot of the coordination ends up actually being self-governed by the group instead of governed by me, because you've made the strategy and the tactics transparent and given concrete ownership to people. And it gets a little awkward because there'll be people who like want to be the data captain and like don't do their shit in the right, and you have to be like, oh, this line is red and delayed, like, Bob, what's going on? Why is it red and delayed? You know, do you need help, or do we need to send this to someone different? And that's where this person comes in. But I'm sure you guys have seen that in corporate context too. It's hard to deploy in a volunteer setting because everyone gets awkward about power, which is really what it comes down to, is respectful power. Did you have a question? No, you're just flipping your hair. Okay, great.
Well,
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
well, one thing in what I'm hearing you say, and